And I think the best place to begin with all of this is where the action was, and that is the creation of the Federal Reserve System. And that takes us directly to the title of my book, The Creature from Jekyll Island. You can almost hear the music being played in the background as they do some kind of a spot commercial to sell this book. I have to admit I had a lot of fun with that title because I had this fantasy in my mind that someday it might be in a bookstore window and people would pass by and think, oh, it's a sequel to Jurassic Park. But anyway, that will never happen, I'm sure. The fact of the matter is, for those of you who know a little bit about this topic, the title has quite a bit of meaning in it. And we have a lot to learn by exploring what that meaning is. First of all, Jekyll Island is a real island. It's off the coast of Georgia. And it was on that island back in 1910 that the Federal Reserve System was conceived at a highly secret meeting that took place there. And what I'd like to do is talk about this meeting and show you that, in fact, the Federal Reserve was created there, and that there was a lot of secrecy surrounding it. And then we'll be confronted with the question, why the secrecy? When things are done in secret, there are often things to hide. And we'll explore what it was that they wanted to hide. And when we finally understand what that was, we'll be face to face with one of the most important facts about the Federal Reserve System that is not generally known. In 1910, Jekyll Island was privately owned by a small group of millionaires. In those days they were millionaires. In today's dollars they would be billionaires from New York. This is where their families went to spend the winter months. It was a resort island, a resort club. It was called the Jekyll Island Club. And there was a very elaborate clubhouse there, which was the center of their social activities. It's still there, by the way, if anybody wants to visit it. The island has been purchased by the state of Georgia, and this clubhouse has been renovated. It's a beautiful thing. And around this clubhouse, they had cottages, which were built by many of the families that belonged to the club. Cottages are not exactly the word I would have chosen to describe these structures. I remember on taking the tour through one of them, the guide said that there were 14 bathrooms in that cottage. So you have an idea of the kind of elegance that was there. In any event, the number of bathrooms has nothing to do with this story. I just get hung up on that because it's hard for me to imagine a cottage with that much running plumbing. But the important point was that this is where the Federal Reserve System was conceived, is in that clubhouse. So let's tell that story. It all began in November of 1910 when Senator Nelson Aldrich sent his private railroad car to the New Jersey Railroad Station, where there it was in readiness for the arrival of himself and 6 other men who were instructed to come under conditions of great secrecy. For example, they were told to come one at a time, not to be seen together, not to dine together on the night of their departure. If they had arrived at the same time, they were instructed to pretend as though they didn't even know each other. They were to avoid newspaper reporters, because these were well-known men, and had they been spotted by reporters, which often frequented the railroad station, especially had they been seen together, many questions would have been asked. One of the men carried a shotgun in a big black case, so that if he had been asked where he was going, he was prepared to say that he was going on a duck hunting trip. And the interesting thing about that little piece of the history is that this man, we find out later from his biographer, never fired a gun in his life. He even had to borrow that shotgun in order to participate in this deception. Even after they got on board the railroad car, this pattern continued. They were told to use first names only, not to use last names. And 2 of the men adopted code names completely. The reason for that is that they were afraid that the servants on board the train would recognize who they were if they used their last names. And they knew that if word leaked out in that fashion and eventually found its way into the press, the whole purpose of the meeting would have been completely destroyed. So absolute secrecy was essential. Well, the train traveled for 2 nights and a day on a 1,000-mile journey to the south, and when they awoke on the second morning, the car was on the siding, the railroad siding at Brunswick, Georgia. And from there they took the ferry boat across the inland strait to Jekyll Island and to the clubhouse. And for the next 9 days, these men sat around a table and hammered out all the important details of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System. And incidentally, if you visit that clubhouse today, you can walk down to the end of the one corridor there, and on a door is a brass plaque. And it says, "In this room, the Federal Reserve System was created." When they were done, they got back on board the train, back to New York, and disappeared. And for quite a few years after that, these men denied that any such meeting ever took place. It wasn't until after the Federal Reserve was firmly established that only then did they begin to talk openly about it. They wrote books on it. One of them wrote a magazine article, and they gave interviews to newspaper reporters. And so now, many years later, it's possible for us to go to the public record and find in print detailed descriptions of what happened at that meeting. Well, who were these men? The first one I've already mentioned, the one with the railroad car, Senator Nelson Aldrich, who was the Republican whip in the Senate. He was also chairman of the National Monetary Commission, which was that special committee of Congress which was created for the purpose of proposing legislation which was to reform banking. That was the idea. Banking needed reform. And the American people were greatly concerned in those days over things that were going on in the banking industry. People were losing their money in the banks because they weren't keeping their promises to hold their deposits in reserve. There were runs on the bank, and the banks couldn't pay the people back. But most of all, they were concerned over the concentration of financial power that was in the hands of a small group of very powerful and large banks in New York on Wall Street. This is what they called the money trust. That was the name, and it was a very popular expression in the newspapers. And quite a few politicians were elected to office on their campaign promise to break the grip of the money trust. President Wilson was one of those politicians, by the way. So, that was the purpose of the National Monetary Commission, which was to propose legislation which eventually became the Federal Reserve Act to break the grip of the money trust over the financial markets of America. Aldrich was a business associate of J.P. Morgan. He was the father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller, Jr., which means, of course, that eventually he became the grandfather of Nelson Rockefeller, our former vice president. If you remember, his full name was Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, so he derived his middle name from his famous grandfather. The second person at the meeting was Abraham Piatt Andrew, who was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. He later became a congressman, but he was very prominent in banking circles. Frank Vanderlip was there. He was the president of the National City Bank of New York, which was the largest and the most powerful of all the banks in the country, representing the financial interests of William Rockefeller and the international investment firm of Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Henry Davison was there. He was the senior partner of the J.P. Morgan Company. Charles Norton was present. He was the president of the First National Bank of New York, which was another one of the giants. Also, there was Benjamin Strong, who was the head of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust Company, And incidentally, 3 years later, when the Federal Reserve System was finally created, he became the first head of the system. And finally, there was Paul Warburg, who was probably the most important of all the men there because of his knowledge of banking as it was practiced in Europe. Paul Warburg was born in Germany. He eventually became a naturalized American citizen. He was a partner in Kuhn, Loeb & Company. He was a representative of the Rothschild banking dynasty in England and France. And through all the years of his banking in America, he remained in very close contact with his brother, Max Warburg, who was the head of the Warburg Banking Consortium in Germany and the Netherlands. Paul Warburg was one of the wealthiest men in the world. And those of you who are Little Orphan Annie fans, you'll remember Daddy Warbucks. Well, Paul Warburg was the real Daddy Warbucks, after whom that character was named. And everyone at the time knew it. I have his photograph in the book. If you'd like to compare his picture to the drawing rendition of Daddy Warbucks, you'll see the similarity between Warbucks and Warburg. And also, while we're on the subject of cartoon characters, anyone who's played Monopoly will remember the drawing of the capitalist with the handlebar mustache and the cigar. That's J.P. Morgan. Those are the 7 men who were on Jekyll Island, and as incredible as it may seem, they represented approximately 1/4 of the wealth of the entire world. And these are the men that sat around a table on Jekyll Island and created the Federal Reserve System. What's going on here? Should arouse our curiosity a little bit. It didn't just happen. Well, speaking of it just happening, for the skeptics, you're probably wondering, did it really happen that way? Perhaps Griffin is exaggerating this to make a point. Well, yes, it really happened that way, and to illustrate that, we could go to a lot of documentation, but to simplify this, I'd like to just read for you a short excerpt taken from one article written by Frank Vanderlip, who was one of the attendees at that meeting. And this was written in the Saturday Evening Post, and it appeared on February 9, 1935. And this is what Vanderlip said. I do not feel it is any exaggeration to speak of our secret expedition to Jekyll Island as the occasion of the actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System. We were told to leave our last names behind us. We were told further that we should avoid dining together on the night of our departure. We were instructed to come one at a time, and as unobtrusively as possible, to the railroad terminal on the New Jersey littoral of the Hudson, where Senator Aldrich's private car would be in readiness, attached to the rear end of a train to the south. Once aboard the private car, we began to observe the taboo that had been fixed on last names. We addressed one another as Ben, Paul, Nelson, and Abe. Davison and I adopted even deeper disguises, abandoning our first name. On the theory that we were always right, he became Wilbur and I became Orville, after those 2 aviation pioneers, the Wright brothers. The servants and train crew may have known the identities of 1 or 2 of us, but they did not know all, and it was the names of all printed together that would have made our mysterious journey significant in Washington, in Wall Street, even in London. Discovery, we knew, simply must not happen. Well, why? What's the big deal here? What's wrong with a group of bankers getting together in private and talking about banking or banking legislation? And the answer to that question is provided by Vanderlip himself in the same article. He said, if it were to be exposed publicly that our particular group had got together and written a banking bill, that bill would have no chance whatever of passage by Congress. Why not? Because the purpose of the bill was to break the grip of the money trust. And ladies and gentlemen, it was written by the money trust. It's as simple as that. Had that fact been known from the very beginning, the public would never have accepted it as a means of breaking the grip over the money trust. And we would never have had a Federal Reserve System because the scam would have been exposed from the beginning. This was like having the fox build the hen house and install the security system. So there is a primary reason for the secrecy. And it's a fact that most Americans have not even considered, that there might have been some kind of deception, massive deception at the very inception of the Federal Reserve System, and for a very good reason. But there's more to it than that, a lot more than that.